Good day. My name is Gaël Giraud. I'm a French Jesuit, and I'm the director of the Environmental Justice Program at Georgetown University, which is part of the broader Emergent Ethics Network, together with the Kennedy Institute, the Pellegrino Center, and the Future Data Center. I'm going to talk today about some transdisciplinary ideas for emergent ethics that we could share within the Emergent Ethics Network. The first point I would like to emphasize is that, as Pope Francis would say in Spanish, todo está conectado. Everything is connected, in the sense that I do believe that, being trained as an economist and a mathematician, I have a lot of things to share together with physicians and with philosophers who are concerned with bioethics. So in order to prove that, I'm going to suggest that we should take a problem-based approach in our conversation. That is, we should start with the most pressing problems that we have to solve today in our society, and then slowly, problems after problems, grow in generality. In other words, what we could try to construct together in our conversation is a kind of iterative universalism, as Michael Walzer would call it. That is, a universalism which is not, an a priori universalism that is supervening everything, but something that is constructed through history, through experience, and through the dialogue that we may have on concrete case studies. The second point I would like to emphasize is that I do believe that if we are to work together in a fruitful way, we need to be convinced that emergence is possible. That is, that through this conversation among people who are stemming from different backgrounds, then something new may emerge that none of us would have imagined or thought about if we were to work separately. This is very important because it turns out that many economists believe that emergence is not a question for themselves, in the sense that the standard epistemology of, let's say, mainstream economics assumes, to begin with, that there is no emergent phenomenon in economics. This is what we used to call micro-foundation of macroeconomics, the idea that everything that is taking place at the aggregate level in macroeconomics should be reducible to what's happening at the micro level, let's say at the level of a firm or a household. This is a way to negate the possibility of emerging phenomena. Whereas in many sciences, including physics, biology, chemistry, of course, there are many emerging phenomena. Let me just give you an example. Thermodynamics is a way to understand what's happening at the aggregate level from the interaction of billions and billions of small particles, which are studied by quantum mechanics, and the gap between what's happening at the level of the particle on the one hand, and what's happening at the aggregate level, on the other hand, this is known as being statistical physics. So statistical physics tries to understand how the aggregation of billions and billions of particles leads to new phenomena that you would never have deduced from the understanding of a single particle. Another very simple example is a pile of sand. If you just study one grain of sand, you will never be able to understand the dynamics of a pile of sand, obviously. So my opinion is that if we are to work together within the Emergent Ethics Network, then we have to take into consideration the possibility of emergence. And this is something somehow new in economics, except for those economists who are dealing with complexity economics and who accept, to begin with, the possibility of emergence. Ultimately, it seems to me this kind of conversation that we could have together will lead sooner or later to what Germans would call grundsätzliche Fragen, that is to, these fundamental questions that many philosophers are dealing with today, such as should we promote an eco-centered ethics, that is an ethics where nature would be at the center, or an anthropocentered ethics, an ethics where human beings would be at the center, or why not even a theocentered ethics, that is an ethics where God would be at the center. And my conviction is that if we go further in this conversation, we might make the experience that actually these different viewpoints are not competing against each other. At least this is what I try to show in my PhD in theology, which is going to be published this year in French, and maybe possibly in the coming years in English. That is, if we, but in order to understand that, we need to revisit Catholic theology, Christian theology itself, and to understand how the fact that God is withdrawing to leave us free within a creation in order to invent our history and our future, this might be a theocentric way to understand how ecocentrism and anthropocentrism do not compete against each other. Another point I would like to mention before going into the details with a number of concrete problems is that even for economists, I do believe that ethical questions are key today. There is a trend of literature which tries to convince us that economists should not deal with ethics, that economics is not a moral science, and that economics is just a neutral science. One argument goes as follows. It consists in taking seriously the original position by John Rawls in his very famous book, Theory of Justice, where he tries to understand justice as fairness. And as you remember, maybe, the idea is that justice is what emerges, actually, when a number of people are put behind the veil of ignorance. They don't know where they are going to be located within the society. And then behind this veil of ignorance, they are going to make big choices at the level of the constitution of the society. And what people like Carif and Bill Zame, try to prove is that actually we could pierce the veil, and that the behavior of people behind the veil of ignorance is deducible from the behavior they have when they are going to shop, when they are shopping in the morning. And since the tastes and preferences of people when they are shopping are arbitrary, so goes the argument, then the decisions we could make at the constitutional level are just arbitrary. It turns out that I proved in another paper that this argument is wrong, or at least can be reversed, in the sense that actually we could also, within the same theoretical framework, prove that the behavior of people in front of the veil of ignorance, when they go shopping in the morning, can be deduced from the big decisions they would take behind the veil of ignorance when choosing, let's say, the constitution of our country. In other words, the choices we make when we go shopping are not independent from our ethical values. And economics is a moral science. And this is obviously true when you think in terms of ecology. The way we are eating today, for instance, meat, has a huge influence on the ecological crisis. The more rapidly we all become vegetarian, the more rapidly it will be possible to try to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And the last point I would like to mention is that I do believe that if we are to have a fruitful conversation within the emergent ethics network, then this means that we need to put into practice a kind of transdisciplinary method. Transdisciplinary means not only interdisciplinary, that is, we need to talk between, let's say, physicians, bioethicists, economists, climate scientists, but also that we have to invite in our conversation actors who are working on the ground, on the field, like physicians, who come with their own concrete problems that they are meeting every day, or like, activists working or fighting even, why not, for climate in the Amazon, etc., etc. So transdisciplinarity, it seems to me, is the last key word for our work to be successful. Let me now try to mention a few examples, a few concrete problems that we could deal with in our future conversation. The first one deals with the issue of real-world data. It turns out that in economics, we do have a controversy today related to what is called RCT, the randomized controlled trials, which are considered very often today as the golden rule of the empirical way to assess whether, let's say, a public policy project is relevant or not. And it turns out that with a number of colleagues and very prominent ones like Angus Deaton, Joe Stiglitz, James Heckman, all of them who got the Nobel Award a couple of years ago, we wrote an op-ed in The Guardian in 2018 where we tried to say, well, it's not clear whether RCTs are really helping for development economics. Let me just quote a few sentences from this article. This is what we wrote in 2018. Truly random sampling with blinded subjects is almost impossible in human communities without creating scenarios so abstract as to tell us little about the real world. And trials are expensive to carry out and fraught with ethical challenges, especially when it comes to health-related interventions. Who gets the treatment and who doesn't? But the real problem with the aid effectiveness craze is that it narrows our focus down to micro-interventions at a local level that yield results that can be observed in the short term. At first glance, this approach might seem reasonable and even beguiling, but it tends to ignore the broader macroeconomic, political, and institutional drivers of impoverishment and underdevelopment. 8 projects might yield satisfying micro results, but they generally do little to change the systems that produce the problems in the first place. What we need instead is to tackle the real root causes of poverty, inequality, and climate change. And it turns out that there is the same controversy in medicine, where you do have, a kind of competition between real-world data on the one hand, that is data that are collected by physicians on the ground in hospitals, etc., and clinical trials. And there is a growing literature arguing that maybe real-world data are at least as interesting as clinical trials, because they provide, for instance, information on the disease natural history that you will never have if you use only clinical trials. It helps also, real-world data also help better positionate and contextualize the clinical benefit of the developed compound, for instance. So there are a number of arguments saying, even prior to the market authorization of a therapy and post-market authorization, real-world data are at least a very interesting and relevant complement to RCTs. So we could have a discussion on this, and it seems to me we really need to have an ethical reflection, both from the viewpoint of economists and from the viewpoint of physicians, about the use of real-world data. The second example I want to mention is genetic manipulations. It turns out that there is a very old theorem from the 30s, proven by Kurt Gödel, which says that there are a number of languages, axiomatic languages, which are incomplete. Incompleteness means that there must exist a sentence which cannot be deduced from the axiomatic, and of which the opposite cannot be deduced either, which means that this sentence is neither true nor false. It's undecidable. So a language for which you have this type of sentences is incomplete. And what Gaël proved in the 30s is that the most basic arithmetic language in mathematics that is deduced from what we call the piano axiomatic, is incomplete in the sense I just explained 30 seconds ago. Now, there is a friend of mine, a French mathematician, Nicolas Boulot, who proved recently that the language that we use when we manipulate DNA is also incomplete in the sense of Giraud. That is, when we manipulate DNA, we are talking with nature. We are engaging in conversation with nature, building new words, new sentences that nature never pronounced. And then the question is, do we know what we're doing when we do that? And the answer is, since this language is incomplete in the sense of Giraud, actually we don't. Because there might be, and for sure there will be, sooner or later, sentences for which it will be impossible to say whether they are true or wrong. And this means that we might be on the verge of constructing monsters for which we won't be able to say whether they can be deduced from the words we are constructing or not. And then this raises a big question, which is the ethical ground for that and the principle of precaution. That this might be very dangerous is not a surprise. There is a very simple example which shows that the Escherichia coli, which is a bacterium that thrives in our intestines, contributing to the balance of the flora. They have been discovered by an entomologist, German entomologist, Karl Escherich, at the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1977, the University of San Francisco decided to give it an industrial destiny by producing somatotropin, a growth hormone made up of 191 amino acids. But its genetic manipulation allowed Escherichia coli to produce a molecule almost identical to somatotropin, but only almost, and this tiny difference was enough to produce results with catastrophic impacts. So this means that the risk embodied with the incompleteness of the DNA language is not an abstract risk. It's a true risk, and we need to have an ethical reflection on that. The third example I want to pinpoint here is what I would call hybrid perspective. Many economists are used to think of the future in terms of what will be the GDP growth, what will be the employment rate, what would be inflation, etc. Now the pandemic has convinced a number of us, I believe, that health is also a key issue, and GDP do not provide you with information about the health in a society. or health inequality, for instance. Employment also don't give you the relevant information for that purpose. So we definitely need to broaden the type of criteria that we're using as economists in order to appreciate the evolution of an economy. And for instance, the very minimal step that we could do in this direction is to use the HDI, the Human Development Index, which is based on 3 pillars. One, which is the income per capita, that's, let's say, the GDP. The other one, which is health and the life expectancy in good health. And the third one is education. So, of course, this is not sufficient. We should add probably a fourth pillar, which is inequality, income inequality, capital inequality, and a fifth pillar, which should be the ecological footprint. And if we were to have this broader viewpoint, then we would be able to say, the main goal for the 21st century of every country on Earth is to converge to a situation where we have a very low ecological footprint, below the carrying capacity of the planet, and at the same time a very high HDI, in the sense that a very high life expectancy, a very high level of education, and probably a very high income per capita and very low inequalities. And if we take this type of criteria in mind, if we have them in mind, then this means that everybody has to do an effort. I mean, the US are not a model, and Europe is not a model either, because both in the US and in Europe, we do have a high life expectancy, even though this life expectancy is reducing today in the US. We do have a high level of education, even though there might be pockets of uneducated people both in Europe and in the US. But we have a very high ecological footprint, which is much way above the carrying capacity of the planet. Whereas in many very poor countries, like, for instance, Chad, they have a very low ecological footprint, which is really below the carrying capacity of the planet. But of course, as you know, they have a very low education level and very, very short life expectancy. So everybody has to change and to engage into a transition. Let's call it the ecological transition, which is a process where at the end of the day, everybody should converge towards a situation which is sustainable and which makes sense from a humanistic viewpoint. And this is where perspective enters the picture. We economists, we do a lot of perspective, and we are doing this in the environmental justice program, but we most often we don't look at the good criteria. So what I want to do in this program, and what I want to share with my colleagues from the Emergent Ethics Network, is a type of prospective methodology where we would look at, let's say, the evolution of malaria on Earth. What will be the evolution and the spreading of malaria on Earth if we have +3 degrees at the end of this century? Or what will be the evolution of what is called the schistosomiasis japonica, which is a disease in China, which is quite widespread, unfortunately, and which might also spread further if global warming is going to intensify in the coming decades. So these are big concerns where, as you see, we need to have both economic perspective, climate perspective, and health at the center. And this is what I call a hybrid perspective. And I do believe that in order to put this into practice, we need to have a collaboration between physicians, bioethicians, and climate scientists, obviously, and economists. The fourth and last example I want to give is, let's say, I would call it taking care of our global commons. How do we do that? It turns out that, also the pandemic has shown that health is a global common, in the sense that the health of a family in Wuhan, China, concerns everybody on Earth. So which means that we share this all, and it's very precious and it's very fragile. And we have made this experience now in the past 12 months due to the pandemic. At the same time, 20 years ago, we would have called this a public good, a global public good, but actually health is not a global public good. Why? Because a public good, in the way many economists understand it, means that there should be an administration at the global level, at the world level, and a state that would take care of this public good. And fortunately, we don't have such a state, because probably if it existed, it would be Chinese. But we need an institution that takes care of health at the global level. And as we have seen, the Security Council of the United Nations remained entirely silent during most of the pandemic, was entirely overwhelmed by the crisis. European institutions were very bad at helping Europeans fighting against the virus. And the World Health Organization has not been listened to by many countries, by many states. So there is a big failure here in the big global institutions that we have shaped so far in order to deal with health as a global commons. What is a global commons? This is a resource that is shared by many people within a group, and for which a resource that is fragile in the sense that privatizing this resource kills the resource, and that's the case for health. Because if you think about it, if we privatize health, if we give a price to every therapy, then there will always be poor people who won't be able to afford the price for this therapy. So they will get the virus, and they will spread again the virus. And this means that we will not find a solution to, let's say, the chronic pandemic of the coronavirus. So we definitely need, for instance, to distribute our vaccines for free and to turn health into a global commons, not a private good. In other words, health is neither a public good nor a private good. What remains is a commons. That is something which needs specific institutions where we put around the table all the actors who are concerned by this problem, by health, in order to collaborate, which is to a certain extent completely new, because many economists, including myself, we are used to think in terms of, there is a kind of competition between the state on the one hand and the market. But this does not help find a solution for, let's say, the pandemic. We need a collaboration between the state and the market. We need something like what Bob Jessop would call a collaboration between the state and the market, and I would add a third actor, which is the civil society. It turns out that this is not a purely theoretical and abstract consideration, because there exists already an institution at the international level which is doing precisely that, which is called DNDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which is a platform that has been created in 2003 by some physicians, which deals with therapies against diseases which are neglected by the private sector, because there is no, the people who are suffering from this disease are too poor to pay something that would be interesting in terms of profit for the private sector. And what DNDI does is that they invite around the table both sovereign states, representatives of the private sector, big pharma, and NGOs from the civil society. They work together and they succeed in doing what none of them would do if they were to work alone. That is, in producing therapies against neglected diseases, which they are able to sell, not to give for free, but to sell for a very cheap price. An example is the hepatitis C. You know that hepatitis C is ravaging Egypt today. And the NDI is distributing the therapy against hepatitis C for something like $300 or $400 instead of 2,000 or 3,000 euros in Europe. So this is a big success, which is made possible only through the collaboration of both the states, big pharma, and NGOs from the civil society. And it seems to me the rules that have been put into practice by DNDI in order to make this conversation possible and very fruitful, they should be a source of inspiration for us to build broader institutions at the world level that would take care of what? That would take care of health as a global commons, but also climate, biodiversity, deep oceans, etc., etc. There are a number of global commons which are waiting for the right institutions to take care of them. And it seems to me that's the fourth big challenge on which we could work together within the very promising emerging ethics network of Georgetown University. Thank you.